Okay, I want to welcome everybody to week 6 of xEssentials. Tonight's topic is lessons learned. It's going to be a little different format than in prior sessions. So at different points of the call, Russell's going to ask people to kind of chime in and give their lessons learned on various different topics, and Russell can probably explain that a little. Russell, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ed. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm sharing my screen now. I'm going to pull up the presentation. Assume we're good there. I come from the IT world, and after any major project, what we do is sit down afterwards and really reflect on what went well, what could have been improved, what were our challenges, and we kind of wrap that up and document it, and take that forward to the next project. And so, kind of looking back on the Christmas lighting season and looking back on some of the things we'd done, I really want to do that with the community alongside of you, and try to do that tonight, to try to walk through about 7 different areas of what we go through every season, from layout to setup to tear down to running your show, and go through those and really give people an opportunity to share with each other what went well, what were some challenges, and what we could all do in the future to improve things. So we can, as iron sharpens iron, we can learn from one another and really take these things forward. So as Ed said, I want to keep it open. So tonight, normally we say, all right, everybody mute and everybody be quiet and let's go through a slide deck, and that's fine. But this I wanted to have more as an open format, an open discussion. And so what we want to do is give a lot of folks, well, first of all, why are we doing it? We just really want to learn from each other, and we kind of discussed that already. We're going to have some ground rules on how we operate this. We're going to have, a topic that we're going to go and get feedback on. I'd really love to hear from a lot of you. I know some of us are more vocal than others, and some of us have different experiences. But man, if you're a newbie, we'd love to hear what you've got, and love to hear your kind of your purview on things. And so we'd love for a variety of people to speak up. Everybody's going to have 2 or 3 minutes. We'll try to moderate it so not one person kind of captures all the time. So we'd love to just have a concise 2 or 3 minute answer, and we'll move on to the next one. And I said raise your hand if you have something to share. It might be challenging for me with one monitor, so maybe Ed can help me moderate that, or maybe I can just we can go from. I'm kind of flying blind here as far as the Zoom controls go. So we'll have to just, take turns speaking. And we want to hear not just things that went well, but things that didn't go so well, so we can learn. So the 7 different areas we're going to discuss are planning. So how did you go out and plan your display? What kind of tools did you use? What kind of methods did you use? How did that reflect? And we'll get into some suggested talking points here in a second. Purchasing, did you buy the right amount? What did you do there? Your layout. So how did you develop your layout? What were the things there? Sequencing, setup, running during the season, and then tear down and storage. So looking at those, be thinking right now of what went well, what didn't go well, under those areas, and think about what you could share with the group. So what I'm going to do is go to the first topic now. And what I did is I just put a few talking points down. I don't want to just stick to this and say, all right, here's what we need to do, and here's the questions you have to answer. These were just a few things to get to the point of, just start thinking through the things. So how did you plan your display? Did you go out and look at a bunch of videos? Did you go out and, see some shows in your neighborhood, or see some shows in your community? What resources did you use? Did you use YouTube? Did you get on the forums? Did you get on, the Facebook sites? Did you find that your planning was effective? Did you do too much, too little? And what helps you make an effective plan? And what would make you more successful? So those are just a couple things that I was thinking about as we talked about the planning phase. But I'd love to hear from some of y'all. So if the first guy wants to unmute and talk about your planning and what you did well this year, or what you could have done better in the future, I'd love to hear.
This is Bill Brothers in Texas, and this was a first year for me. And planning is one of my strengths. I've got almost 45 years in the computer software business, so I'm a professional analytic. Ended up with a lot of planning on spreadsheets. Used a lot of Excel and figuring out exactly, how much lighting coverage that I wanted to do. Looked at a lot of different things, a lot of different videos, and a lot of different folks' opinions about, how much you should put up, how much you should try to do in the first year, and ended up putting up about 5,000 pixels. I bought 7,000, but we planned for more than we had the effort to be able to put up. But that was the planning pieces for me.
Very good. So you think your planning was a little aggressive, or did it work out to be fine in the end?
It worked out pretty well. I ended up probably with a little bit more controller capability than I needed for first year, but I'm always happier to have more than enough rather than not enough. So, and I stayed with Falcon and also with Dan's little controllers as overall show controlling.
So as you reflect back on your first year, what would you tell somebody getting into the hobby this year that wants to start planning their display? What would be a valuable tool or a valuable lesson for them to take forward?
Probably the first thing is to sit back and take a picture of your house, print it out on a piece of paper, and start drawing things you might want to put in the yard. And just, if you don't feel confident playing in xLights, start on a piece of paper and think about, where you want to put stuff. And then, look at different props that people have or you can buy or that you can make, and start estimating how many LEDs that's going to be, and figure out if your budget's going to withstand that, because there's a direct relationship.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Who else has a planning lessons learned?
So Russell, I'll chime in for a second here. I am a serial procrastinator at times, and unless I set a definitive due date on things. So one of the things you had touched on, I know, in last year's series is kind of looking at the whole process of, I try to set dates for, I want to buy all of first I design what I want to do on my layout by, a certain date. So a March 1st date, I want to have my layout done, and then I'm going to have purchased everything by a certain date. And then usually have all of my props built by a certain date, and then all of my enclosures and everything built. And then you kind of change things around and you get all your sequencing done as well by a certain date. So for me is setting, goals and timetables for a lot of things. And I think that's real important because there are a lot of different things involved in this hobby, and making lists. One of the things I also do is when I set things up, I have checklists of things as I'm going through the process so that I know exactly what I've done or what I still need to do. So just setting goal dates and target dates is kind of how I work.
That's good feedback. So, and I got that. That was a problem for me in planning this year. Is I started out with no plan, and I just said, well, I'm going to do what I did last year and maybe add some stuff. Then I went to Expo and ended up buying a lot of props, and did went out there and bought lights for those. Started incorporating those, and then as the Greatest Shows sequence came along, I said, well, those pixel nets are really cool, and I want to do some more in my windows. And I had so much scope creep that I was going in 100 different directions and never gave myself those target dates and those target milestones. And I found myself late December still building stuff, and it was a mess because I'm building props and I've needed to sequence, and I have mapped some and I've sequenced some, but now I've added more things. I'm going in there and having to go and remap and re-render and do a whole bunch of stuff really late in the season when I should have already had it on the house. And so not having those target milestones really kind of bit me. And I think you bring up a good point. Do you hold yourself accountable to that? Do you say, listen, if I don't have this prop built by September, I'm not going to do it?
No. Truthfully, a week into the show, I might have add something. But I think to chime in on what you said is, you want to see what Boscoyo has the latest and greatest at Expo, and that's the third week in July. And then once you do buy it, then you're ordering custom made from Ray. At least that's what I do.
Yeah.
And so many people have joined the hobby where Ray used to be able to get you stuff in 2 to 3 weeks. It's now 6 weeks out if you wait. So I can't encourage people to really get those main props in early enough with your counts if you're going to do that, or you're going to be sitting there soldering stuff and making your own custom links. So
yeah, I think that's great feedback, and it gets to be no fun. Like I said, when you procrastinate and you don't have those targets, I tell you what, it gets stressful for me. It really does. Thanks. Who else has a planning lesson learned?
I've got some information. Earlier this year, I had the bright idea of trying to light up my entire street. I'd seen it done a couple of times. And I talked to a couple of neighbors and go, yeah, we'd be interested in that. And then the process came of, well, how much is it going to cost? So I started trying to figure out every step of the way, and then also what can go wrong. And a big thank you to Bill Porter, who helped me out a lot, and also this group that I, shared my spreadsheet and said, here's what I'm thinking about doing. And then when it all came right down to it, I felt that it was too much of an ask to go to each neighbor and say, hey, if you want to be on this, it's going to cost you X. So I shelved the idea and maybe another time. At about the same time, I had submitted a letter to the local symphony orchestra about putting a mega tree in their holiday display, and they bit on it. And so just finally today, I got the final thumbs up that we are going to go to contract with it. And for the past several weeks, it's all been planning of what are we going to do? How much is it going to cost? I need to see a budget. I need to see a proposal every step of the way. So there was a lot of time just sitting here staring at the wall, putting it together in your head, saying, all right, how am I going to put it together? What do I need to put it together? Well, I need duct tape. I need baling wire. I need fishing line. I need X number of screws. I need X number of power supplies. And just keep going over and over and over that in your head. And you'd be amazed how long that list gets really quickly when you're required to give them a budget and a proposal. And it helps you in the long term determine, hey, if you got a budget in mind to do this for your house, and you say, all right, I'm going to spend $1,000 on my house for Christmas, you might want to figure out how you're going to spend every single nickel of that, and you may find that you're going to spend more than that. As somebody has said, $1 a pixel, and based on my costing and budgeting, yeah, it's about $1 a pixel.
Yeah. It really is. I mean, and I did that same study last year and found out just what you're saying, the people who keep the best notes and the best records, that cost for the finished show per pixel increases to about $1 a pixel. Whereas I tell myself mentally, it's 25 cents a node. That's not the case. So, in preparing for this talk, talk to a lot of people, and I think I hear a common thread already about documentation and about research, and that's something I struggle with. But I think that making lists and setting milestones and documenting and keeping up with your records really does ease things and really does help that process. The better you plan, the better you write stuff down, the better you document, the more prepared you are for the season. And I've heard that common theme tonight, and I have a lot just talking to people in preparation for this. That documentation thing that I tend to subside. I just like to dive in and play with the latest goodie and the latest prop and the latest tool, and don't really get involved with the documentation side of it. And I think that's a lacking on my part, and I think it really does help things go smoother.
One of the things that the theater wanted to do, they wanted to put a mega tree on the canopy on the front of the theater. And I was, that would look amazing. Let's do that. Well, as we got into it, it became a bigger question of safety, 60-mile-an-hour winds, planning, how are we going to run wires, how are we going to run power, how are we going to make this work? And in reality, when it came down to it, and a lot came from last week's talk, we opted to pass on it just because there were too many unknowns in it for the safety of the public. It didn't seem like a good idea at this time. There's that phrase again.
Right. All right. Does anybody else have anything for planning?
So I'll add a sort of a postscript to that. My planning ended up being fairly good for knowing what props I was going to have in place and knowing what kind of wiring I needed and knowing what all my terminations would be and how much power supplies I needed, how many boxes. That went really, really well. But because I live in a neighborhood where there's a very tight set of rules for the community association, my plan of how I attach my props to my house turned out to be completely inadequate. So I had to engineer special ways of mounting stuff because when the 15th of January rolls down, they cannot see any mounting points and they can't see any leftover hooks or anything that's not painted, etc. So you can plan all you want to, but you're still going to find some holes.
Well, that's pretty tight. I've never heard of HOAs that stringent, but maybe that's a good lesson learned for everybody. So if you do live in somewhere with a stringent HOA or even a spouse or whatever, to really think about things like that, to think about your mounting and to think about what stuff's going to look like in the off season and to kind of research that ahead of time. So I think that's a valuable thing to take forward for all of us, especially if you have some aesthetic requirements.
Russell, you've got 3 folks in the queue here. So Santa Dave.
Okay. Russell, kind of what I was doing this last year when I was trying to work at the school and do a big indoor display and everything and have people sit down and all that. And I would have to say that one of the issues that I ran into was it wasn't planned out soon enough for them to go ahead and schedule the building and get the facility and work out all the details in advance to be able to do that. No, go ahead.
So timing and scheduling then, so getting stuff ahead of the curve.
Yes. Yeah, and I guess I've got a question too in reference to something that Joel said, is if you're trying to do something like, let's say, they're trying to do it at a park or something like that, do you try to recoup all your cost in the first year, or do you break it up over 2 years? And then how do you figure out what you want to charge for what you're going to actually make on the project itself? So I guess that would be a question that I would have in reference to that.
Sure, and I have no idea. I've never ventured into the commercial space, but what I would say is fortunately there's lots of people that have here. I mean, I know Clyde and Rob have done a lot of commercial work. I know James at Boscoia has done a lot of commercial work, and so leveraging folks like that to ask those questions, and I think that's good resources to have that we have in the community. And there's more than that. That's just the 2 I can come up with off the top of my head, but to reach out to those folks.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to talk afterwards, or or another time, we can.
Okay, thank you.
So Jim Nealon.
I had to unmute myself. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't think about is the fact that when you're getting ready to do all this stuff, you better think a little bit about where you're going to store it. When you take it down, all of a sudden you look and say, whoops, where am I going to put all this stuff? Especially if you got big items. So I always like to add a storage issue on my end of my list.
Well, that's a good call. And I do have storage at the end. That's my last bullet. But I think that's important. As you said, during the planning phase, you get all star-eyed and everything else about buying these things. I built, before I did pixels, I built a 22-foot mega reindeer out of plywood, and that thing's huge, and it looked really cool at the time. But I still, to this day, have that thing. I'm tripping all over because I didn't really think about, once all the novelty's done and once all the, the season's over with, what am I going to do with this thing? And so I do think as you're planning to have that cradle to grave life cycle in mind when you're buying stuff. So that's good advice.
Well, it's not only that, but if you're planning to leave it outside, let me tell you, I got a monkhouse jump tree. I cannot get the bottom hole out of the base because it's been sitting outside off season for 5 years.
Yeah.
So when I built an ASAP tree this year for a second tree, I made sure that I took that pipe out of there as soon as the season was done.
That's a good lessons learned. I do the same thing, and I also put a little bit of grease in the threads to kind of keep it from corroding.
Yeah, I've also left arches outside, and I use landscape edging arches, and then you go to put them up, and they're full of cobwebs and all kinds of stuff from falling off the trees and blowing around, and they're really filthy. So better if you can figure out how to take them apart, straighten them out, put them in a storage someplace.
So, Ann?
I'm done.
I think with one that's as big as mine, our real problem has always been it's just the two of us trying to get a display up in time. And I've finally taken a lesson from Mickey and Minnie Bouse and gone to various science classes at the school and Boy Scout troops and got a sign-up list so that I've got people to help me when my husband's off at work, continue to get it up so it'll go up in time.
So, Ann, I got a good question about that. I've had people reach out to me. I think people want to help. People see it. People are enamored by it. People want to help. But I tend to turn people, even my own family, I tend to say, well, it's going to take me more time to sit there and explain to you how to wire this or how to do this or that than me just to do it. So how do you overcome that hurdle? Because that's something I've struggled with is by the time you get done instructing everybody, I feel like I could have just done it myself, but maybe that's just my own pride getting in the way.
Well, Mickey warned me of that. He said, you really have to be a project manager, which is what I was in my real life before I retired. You just have to sit down and really think, what is it that they can do and what is it that I have to do?
Right. And so you can just, I guess, as far as just pulling things out of storage and getting them out into the yard and getting
right. And kids aren't too bad about plugging things in. I don't let them go up the trees. I don't let them go up on the roof. But, they'll do a lot of stuff. They can help me mount controllers. They can do all kinds of things. And they're curious. They want to know.
Yeah, and I think it does. And especially when you're dealing with kids and stuff, you're really inspiring the next generation. I had a lot of kids, kind of stop and ask how things are working. I was always glad to take them behind the scenes. And I had a few pixels cut up that I'd give to them and kind of show them, here's how it works. Here's how everything needs data, and here's how it communicates, and different things like that. And you can really see some lines being connected in their head, and people enjoy it. So especially when it comes to technology and science and all that, you really like to inspire them.
Well, and getting a science teacher, particularly if you're using pies, they're using pies at school. They're interested.
Right.
Jim Evans.
Yeah, this was my first year with a big addition with Pixels. I built my first mega tree this year. When I did my Pixels, pushing them into the strips, I did it during the summer when it was nice and warm, and they push in real fast and easy. And you can just breeze right along and get a string done, set it aside, start the next one, and get that one done, start the next one. And didn't really do the testing until fall when I started putting the tree together and doing some testing with it. I discovered I had a couple strips where I skipped a hole and or put two pixels together, and so then I had to remove the pixels when it was cold out, and it sucked.
Been there.
So definitely double checking as you go along, and then testing in case you run into a bad pixel later. That wasn't such a big deal, but having to restring, reseat the pixels in the cold was a real headache. And then the other thing I had a problem with after the season was done, my big star on top of the mega tree was mounted to Schedule 80 PVC pipe, and thought that would be strong enough, but I wanted it light so it'd be easy to get up on top, mounting it. And the wind took it down after the season, which was lucky. But next year I know to put in a steel pipe for the base at least.
Okay, Barry. And so just Barry, and that's it.
Yeah, and then we'll cut it. We'll go to the next. Yeah,
we got to move along.
Yep.
Sorry.
I'll be pretty quick. So I've been doing this for a while. So every year you look for something new. And I tend to like to try to be a little unique on my display. So I tend to watch a lot of videos through the year. As a matter of fact, I appreciate some people just publish their stuff the last few weeks, but I'm always looking for an idea to add to the display, and I'll actually keep a running wish list. And I'll see a video, I'll put a link to the video in that list, and then go back and say, hey, this was kind of neat. So like these first couple months of the years, I've been pulling up kind of the things I want to add to my display. But watching other people's displays, seeing how they're using different types of, could be props, it could be other, ways that they're doing their lighting, helps me kind of move in where I want to go for the following year.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I'm inspired by other people. Well, thanks for the feedback, guys. This is great. This is just what I had in mind as far as really learning and hearing a lot of great stuff. So we'll go on to the next topic. So purchasing. We talked a little bit about planning things and getting ideas and going forward. So once you get that stuff planned out, how'd your purchasing go? And I've been very transparent with my first year. I overbought a lot of unnecessary stuff and underbought a lot of necessary stuff. And that was a battle for me that I've learned from. And so, how do you get that balance? So how do you, order the correct thing? Did you do pre-sales, or did you find that it was better just to order it as you need it? Did you go overseas, or did you order it from U.S. vendors? And what would you recommend for somebody to do better next year? So tell us about your purchasing lessons learned.
So, Bill, you're up first.
It works better if I unmute.
Okay.
Yeah, so I bought originally from Holiday Coro got the tail end of their spring sale, where I bought the majority of my pixels, and got a little skittish towards the middle of the year and ordered some add-on from Ray, and it worked out that what I ordered from Holiday Coro had the wrong termination on it, and it only had it on one end. And it wasn't described well in his stuff, and so I ended up with several thousand pixels that I had to re-terminate. So that was a didn't go too well kind of thing. I got to where I was really good about putting new terminations on though, and I did buy too many, but I'm glad I bought too many because I had some pixel dropout problems when my show came along. Right.
So yeah, just and I've been the same way. To research and be very specific about what you are ordering and what you're getting. And I think that's a good lesson. All right, who else?
I did a large order of pixels with Daniel Zhang early in the year because he had a quote unquote defective batch where 1 in 500 was a bad pixel, which was easy to pick out. And some other stuff that I knew there was going to be a sale in the summer with a couple of vendors. So I waited, and by the time the sale came, the discount that I got wasn't really worth the wait. Yeah. So getting your stuff ordered as early as you can, so you got a lot of time to start putting things together. And because you wait until summer, and then you're doing a lot of stuff last minute, and it could get behind schedule, and then really struggling if you run into trouble during setup.
So there's a comment in chat. One mistake I made the first year was buying without pigtails. It's simply not worth the time to solder on the ends myself. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Amen to that. Absolutely, yeah. And fortunately, that's getting less and less common. The vendors are most all offering pigtails now, and with that, you can go, and most all of them now are offering X-Connect as an option. So if you specify X-Connects with about any of the vendors, you can have kind of that universal standard, that universal sweet spot. But yeah, anything that's in my newbie 101 presentation always is anytime you can let the vendors do the work for you, you're almost always better off letting them do it. They'll do it for pennies on the dollar, if not free, and let them customize it, let them put pigtails on it, and don't do that yourself. So that's great advice. And that, it's especially true when people say, well, I can get them on Amazon or I can get them on eBay cheaper. Man, if you look at the factor of you're going to have to order $3 worth of pigtails and another $1 worth of miscellaneous heat shrink and solder tubes and everything else, and you start factoring your time about, it's just not worth it. There's no savings, and you end up with a spliced up pigtail or a spliced up spoon.
So let me add one thing before you move on, Russell, on this is when my first year buying pixels, I had somebody, a veteran guy, look over my order, and he knew what I was going to buy, but I didn't understand all of the different chipsets and what IP meant and everything. So he was able to point out one or two things I didn't have and 2 or 3 things that I should have. So I needed extra extensions and things like that. So it's definitely helpful to, I know there are veteran people that will help you out when you go to place a big order. So.
Yep. I'm one of those people. If you ever need help, like I said, let me know. I've done that for a lot of folks. PM me what you're getting to do. And another thing I tell people to do is be very literal when you order things. I mean, especially when you order from overseas, specify the exact wire spacing, the exact wire color, the exact wire gauge, the pigtails pre-attached, because I've had people order, pigtails before, and they'll throw them in the box separate than the strings themselves. And so be very literal when you do that. And Ed's absolutely right. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to help just glance over stuff and say, all right, you're doing okay here. Well, I'd recommend you do something else there. And, if you post that on Facebook, somebody will help you. And they say, if you want to PM somebody, they'll help you. So I think that's a good point.
And never try to buy exactly what you need.
Right, buy extra.
You will get burnt. I've never regretted having extra, but I sure as hell have been upset when I had to go back and buy more later.
Right. So that was my 4th bullet point on this is how much extra would you recommend somebody buy? So if I'm placing my order and I'm planning for a 5,000 pixel show, what kind of overage am I looking at? What would you recommend?
I don't know about pixels, but when it comes to pigtails, people always seem to don't have enough. And I always tell people, figure out what you need on pigtails, double it, and add 10%. You'll always use them up.
Yeah, that's truth to that.
And those are cheap. You never want to waste time on cheap things because it'll cost you more to ship pigtails than it will to buy them.
Right.
Well, and on pigtails, make sure you get the right length, because there's a 50 centimeter and a 15.
Yes.
And you don't want the shorties. You want the long ones for enclosures.
I agree.
Okay.
One thing too about the spacing between pixels is always think like on bullet nodes is when you send it in is the spacing between pixels, they count the wire. Yep. So the space that they solder into the bullet node, they count that. So if you want your pixels 4-inch spacing, order 5-inch spacing,
Yep, that's very true. That's great feedback. If you're exactly right, look at Bosco or whatever. If you got a prop that requires 4-inch spacing or whatever that is 4-inch spaced, you need to go an inch up. I agree with that completely, because even if it does fit, the wires are so stinking tight that it's just bad for it. You're putting too much strain on everything. So I always order the next length up if I can help it.
I've never seen anybody regret 4-inch spacing, but I've sure seen a lot of people regret 3-inch and 2-inch.
Yep, I'm one of them. So learned that my first year. All right, let's go on to the next, which is layout. So this is, aside from planning, where you're getting the actual, ideas and kind of the general design of your show. So when you do the layout, and I'm talking about in xLights, and I'm talking about in other ways, how do you lay out your display? And at what point in the year do you do this? And that comes from, me sharing that I've got my show in so much flux until it's like game time, that my layout's never really set. What tools do you use aside from xLights to really get that layout down and kind of designed? And from what point do you design from? And then as you do your layout, did that really match? Because I have that problem a lot. I'll go out there and put things in my layout, but then in reality, once again with those pixel nets this year, I had so many problems, and then I ran out of pixels, and then I ran out of netting, and I had it designed and laid out really well, but it didn't end up matching my real show. I had to go in there and toss a lot of that stuff at the end in my layout. So talk about your challenges, talk about your, do you just kind of go in flux, or do you have a written plan? And then what about your controllers, and how do they play into your layout? Because that's something that I struggle with every year too, is I've got a general design that I play off of, but when it gets, I feel like I kind of set things up differently from year to year, which is a fallback for me. And so do you have a kind of a written way you do things, and then how do you account for your controller design in that?
No, I'll take this one. Nobody's going to take it.
All right.
Okay. So what I do, as far as the layout, that's actually the first thing I do before on the start of the year. So even before the show was done, I was making my next year's layouts. And the cool thing about the xLights is, you can download all the models from Display or whoever you decide to get them from. And I would, put all that down, put it in an Excel sheet, figure out how many pixels I need to order. I always add 20% to my pixel orders because Lord knows how many times you have either a bad pixel, or if you need to, add a prop at the last minute, which always happens when the Square comes out with something new late in the year. And I mean, that's pretty much me. I mean, my planning is the layout. So
very cool. So that way you do have a written plan going forward. So how do you decide where your controllers are going to go during that layout process? So, I've been old school up until this year, where I used the Falcon Upload utility, which was another great thing that was a good lessons learned for me, is to kind of let go of my old ways, because when I started, that wasn't a feature. And so I just said, well, this is the way I've always done it. This is the way I'm going to do it. But then I kind of latched onto that this year. But with that, you've got to have pretty good, controller planning, a little bit more thoughtful planning that has to take place. So how do you account for your controller design?
So Kendall's got something he wants to add.
Okay.
Kendall.
On my layout, what I do is I look at it as, what am I after? But also I look at it as a point as, what can I do with it? I'm big on combining props and adding them together in xLights to make different effects. So when I start looking at my layout and I start wanting to put things somewhere in different areas, I'm looking at how can I combine this with something else to submodel it, so when I drop an effect, it does crazy things across both models, not just one. With that, in terms of controllers, is I try to keep my props and stuff to a point to where I can move controllers around, because I'm sort of like you, Russell. I love to move things around from year to year. There's sometimes that I've set up my display in xLights and I've programmed it. I've got it ready for what I think I want, but when I actually start setting up and putting things up, I'm like, I don't really want that there this year.
Yep.
So I will move it, which with the xLights, that's easy to go in and fix. Is, to move around, then redo everything. But it's just keeping that mindset of what do you want and how do you want to do it? Because like I said, I love to take like loops. If you've got 4 or 5 circles, loops that are placed out there, to combine them and do different designs from one to the next. Same thing with spinners and stuff that are connected close by each other. Jumping from one to the next in a continuous pattern like it's one string.
Right.
So looking at things like that, when you're planning your layout, what do you want to do and what do you want to get out of it is one big thing to do and to think about before you actually start putting things out there and start building them, because it's all on what your mindset's got to be, because if you can design it and you want it out there, it's capable of being done.
Sure.
So let me, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a couple things in chat, and then I want to just add one more point before you move on, Russell. Someone said from the last point, I put 1 meter and 5 meter extensions on their pigtails when they order their pixels. So that was on the prior discussion. Another person says, I use a D-sized architectural print on my house elevation, so I could use an architectural ruler. Another person uses CAD And then it allows me to calculate cable runs to different controllers. Another person says, I would like to add that I run Halloween just for the fact that I can offset Christmas display deployment. So they do a Halloween show just for their Christmas show. The deployment time, bats become snowflakes, webs become spinners. And I never actually manually program a Falcon with the auto upload, to Russell's point. So, and then this other person says I built my props wrong, and auto upload breaks my setup. So I'm not sure about that. One thing I did want to add is if you are trying to decide whether you're going to do a 2-inch spacing or a 3-inch spacing on let's say a mega tree, and you don't know whether you want to have a 180 tree or a 270, or you don't know whether it's going to be 75 tall or 100 tall or whatever the different things. xLights great because you can just create four different tree options and then run the same sequence on each tree and see which one you like. So in your planning stage, just create it, put it on there, run something, and then decide, hey, I like this one the best, so that's the one I'm going to go with. So, so Ron, you've got 1 point, and then we'll let Russell move on.
In regards to the layout, it's not just enough to plan where you're going to put your controllers. You also have to figure on the wire patterns for your power injection, because in the final end, when you start combining props, you're going to end up doing some power injection. And that becomes another whole planning process that needs to be considered when you're doing your layout.
Yeah, I think that's good feedback. I agree completely. I was helping a guy in my community kind of do his initial layout. He was a newbie this year, and that's something we had to think about is, power distances, and are we going to be able to run all this off from the controller? We're going to need to do injection, and that became, then you have to account for driveways and sidewalks and different things like that where I might want to inject from. So really thinking through that is wise. So that's a good point. All right. So next is setup. Now we're getting to the fun stuff, right? So, and I've heard some comments already about running Halloween as a test run, and I think there's wisdom in that. I don't do it because, once again, I'm a procrastinator, and Halloween's kind of dead in my neighborhood anyway. Not a lot of little kids and things like that. So I kind of bypass it, but I do see a lot of value in that being a setup time. So what month do you get started setting up? Do you have what you need? And I think some people touched on that earlier as far as props and materials. Did you prepare well during the year and have everything you needed, or did you find yourself scrambling for overnight orders or anything like that? One thing that I struggle with, and this is where I put in here, I'm pretty good when I take things down about marking dead pixels and marking areas that I need to fix, but I don't go back and fix them in the off season, and so I'm dragging out a bunch of dead props. So that's a lessons learned for me, is I need to, and I talked to my wife about holding me accountable of going to the attic in April or whatever and starting to repair things instead of waiting till setup time to do that. Do you pre-test? So people talk about burning in things, new strings, or going out there and plugging everything that before you put it up high. And I think there's a lot of value in that. So what's your pre-testing kind of philosophy? What about safety? So when you go up and set up things, are you all ladders, or do you have you had some experiences where safety is a problem and you go into harnesses and lifts and things like that? How do you mount your stuff? I found some pretty creative things this year that I'll share with magnets. Like I've got a brick house, so I've got metal lintels above the windows. And so for those pixel nets I was talking about, I was able to put rare earth magnets with cup hooks up there and hang those pixel matrices from that. And that worked out pretty well. I also used like C-clamps on standing seam roofing, and I just clamped onto the little piece of roofing there, the little seam in the metal roof, and mounted props from those clamps. And so those were kind of neat things I did this year that I learned. What tools are helpful when you're setting up? As far as lifts go, or ladders go, or ladder stabilizers go, or anything, I don't know. And then an interesting point as I prepared for this, people talked about hiring things out. We talked to a person who had their landscaper hire out the megapole set up and the megatree set up. And I have a friend here in the Carolinas who went on Thumbtack to hire people to kind of set up the high places in his house and set up the roof lines and the ridges. So do you hire anything out, and how did that work out, especially with unskilled labor like we were talking about earlier? So I'll give the floor to you guys.
One thing I always tell people to do is, even if you don't like Halloween, set up enough little lights on your house and your radio transmitter for Halloween that you got all that checked out before Christmas. I don't put anything in the yard per se, but I do have my lights around the windows, my gutters, and my FM transmitter is all checked out now before I ever move on to anything else out in the yard.
Thanks.
Bill?
Yeah, so my CA doesn't allow me to set up before mid-November, so I can't do it Halloween. But in terms of answering the mounting mechanisms, I spent a pretty good amount of time engineering mounting mechanisms that make it easy to set up and take down, and also relatively invisible. So I ended up using a 1/4-inch inserts around my garage door frames, and using what are known as hurricane bolts to be able, and ran those through my tubing, basically to be able to just screw things in and unscrew them and then put them back in their storage position. But the other thing is that they make these little plastic inserts so you can put in there, and they essentially, the inserts disappear, so you can't really see them in your framing. And then for things like snowflakes and things along the roof line, etc., I used what are known as hanger rod bolts. You can get them with wood threads or metal threads, and I screwed those in and then used 1/4-inch threaded rod to be able to hang a lot of things up from underneath the eaves and up over the garage. So a lot of those kinds of things ended up working really well for me from a mounting mechanism. I have stone facade with matrices on the front of them, and I ended up having to drill and tap those and put bolts in them that are pre-painted in the color of the stone. So, I guess to each his own. That's my experience.
Thanks.
So let me add that so this year I added permanent Cat 5 wiring. Prior years I've added outlets in special places. When I first started, I didn't want to put any holes in my walls, but now those days are long over, and I've got permanent things mounted on the house that have just painted the house color. So I've kind of gotten over putting holes in my house and moved on. So.
Yeah, that was a hard mountain for me to climb as well. I didn't want to go, especially as a new guy. You're like, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know, whatever. And I was real reluctant to put anything permanent on my house, and I've kind of let some of that go as well, as far as mounting clips and things like that. I still try not to mar up the house so much, but you really find that it all blends in and nobody pays it any attention once it's all in, and if you do it pretty well. So while you see it, it really blends into everybody else.
Some things that I've mentioned before that I use quite a bit to hang props. I use toilet chain, because you can take and bend a link in the chain and measure it to fit, and it's fairly strong. I use 50-pound test fishing line to tie off, so that way things don't blow from one side to the other. I'm talking about props hanging on your house. And you don't see the 50-pound test fishing line, but it's really fairly strong. And then for tie-off points, I go to Bed Bath & Beyond and buy the longest shower curtain that they've got that is a pressure fit. You put it between and you twist it, which tightens it. And that makes a good spot. You put it on the window right at the point in the window where you really don't see it, and gives you plenty of tie-off points and also hanging points when you want to hang snowflakes in your windows or that sort of thing.
So so that's what I was going to ask is, what do you tie the fishing line to? So you're saying you go out there and use the pressure rods in the windows as tie points?
Right. I use the pressure rods in the windows as the tie-off point. I use the gutters as a tie-off point, the downspouts of the drainage system. And I found that I can take the fishing line, run it around, tie it off a couple of times, and then that where that knot is, I'll put a piece of duct tape on it, and it holds it for 6 weeks, and it never goes anywhere. And I've had some pretty strong winds roll through here, and have had no issues.
That's pretty cool. That's a cool tip and trick. I'd never thought about fishing line, and especially tying it around stuff, because you're right. You can tie it around gutters and all that, and that would work pretty well. That's a good point.
Okay.
Does anybody? So it was an interesting thing. Does anybody else hire out some of your display setup or tear down? Have y'all played with that? Because that was, to me, that's still kind of a foreign concept. But I've heard multiple people say that they do that, and I can see, so if you do, where do you find that individual, and what's the cost behind it?
My suspicion is that this is primarily a DIY hobby, and this group you're talking to is a DIY group.
So I agree, but this is coming from
most of us are not interested in spending money for other people. We'd rather buy more pixels and props.
I agree. Okay, like I said, that's just something I heard as I was talking to people preparing. Is I kind of, I was surprised by that, but intrigued. So especially from a safety aspect, I can get, if you can get a roofer crawling all over the top third story of your house, hanging up hip and ridge lines, I get that. I just don't know how you instruct them to do that. All right. So then running during the season. So this is kind of the glory moment. One thing I learned my first season is that a 45-minute show is super cool, but it doesn't work very well for me in my neighborhood because people tend to stay for that whole length. And I know there's a lot of different views on that, but for me, it was backing up traffic and causing a lot of problems. And I finally figured out, you know what, if I shorten the length of my show, people move on. And so I vary. I have it running for 45 minutes right after Thanksgiving and then right after Christmas. But as I get closer and closer to Christmas, the show gets shorter and shorter. Till the week of Christmas, I'm running like 2 or 3 songs maybe. So do you vary your playlist, or how do you come up with your playlist? Do you run different ones every night, and how do you determine the songs that you play? How do you market your display? Is it word of mouth? Do you use social media? I've got a lure guy here in town who's a good friend of mine. He puts billboards up, like mainstream billboards, like going down the highway. And he's an eccentric guy, and he does a great job. But how do you market? And then how was your traffic? And how did you deal with that? What are your tips and tricks and lessons learned from dealing with heavy traffic? How do you deal with neighbors? So there's a lot of neat strategies out there that I've heard over the years. I had some lessons learned my first year. The neighbors weren't very appreciative of the increase of traffic, and had to learn from that, and had to, kind of learn how to deal with that, and learn how to deal with the traffic, and learn how to try to appease everybody. If that's even possible. It's not really possible, but how to mitigate some of that. And then tell us about some of the rewards you had this year and some of the challenges you had this year. I'd love to hear about some rewarding experiences that you had just running your display, and some stories there from the community, as well as if you had any challenges as you're doing that, and kind of how you saw that and how you overcame that. So I was looking forward to this section.
So I'll chime in. Everybody's kind of quiet. As far as the length of my show, just like you said, Russell, I shortened it at the end of the year. But what I also did is I wanted to be able to have all of the songs available. So, Sunday through Thursday, I had a set playlist of 4 songs, not 3 songs, but 4 songs. And then Friday and Saturday, I let it run a little longer. Do I mark it? No. Traffic was horrible. But I actually spent time, and I just went out there and talked to people and kept them moving along. With the neighbors, the biggest thing I will ever give advice on neighbors is interact with them, engage them, talk to them. The more you engage with your neighbors, usually the better it is. You're going to have 1 or 2 neighbors that are just weird people, but engage with them, and most of them support you.
Thanks.
I'll say one last thing. most rewarding thing is watching my cameras and seeing 25 kids in front of my house dancing and screaming and smiling and singing along. That's the most rewarding thing of them all.
Yeah, it really is. You can see the joy and see people coming. I want to share a rewarding experience. I had a person come by several times, a family come by several times this year, and it was a husband, a wife, and two small boys, and the guy was deaf. And I was talking to his wife, and she said he loves it. And I was like, this is really interesting. It's a musical light show. And he said he loves music, but he can't hear. And this is a way he can feel and he can experience music, and he can experience the lights and experience music through your lights. And I was like, man, that's deep. I'd never really considered that. And I've got a lot of small kids myself, and love the joy behind Christmas and love the children. But thinking about how that could impact somebody, and how someone was using some of their other senses to experience lights and music was really cool. So anyway, that was rewarding for me and something I'd never really considered. So. Oops, I'm still sorry, guys. I was mousing around. So what else? Who else has something that was rewarding during their season?
So Mike. Mike or Bill, one of you.
Yeah, I can go up. Mike's finding his mute button. It was really rewarding for me because I wasn't sure I was going to get mine up, so I didn't tell anybody too much about it other than my neighbors. And I got probably 40 emails from people in my neighborhood, and I got probably 15 cards from people telling me how much they enjoyed the lights, how much their grandkids love the lights. And that was something I really didn't expect of my first year. I was sweating just getting the thing up and running, and the people that came by were just incredible.
Yeah, it makes it all worth it.
So Mike.
All right. Yep. First year for me this past one. So definitely the advice right here on Zoom had probably been the biggest benefit of this whole project. I sat in my whole first year night after night and didn't do anything other than listen to everyone else's issues and learn what not to do before I did the first thing. So this was a tremendous resource, and literally had no complaints about being a first year with 10,000 pixels. So it turned out great. We served about 2,000 vehicles altogether in that 60 days or so, and nothing to complain about whatsoever. The building and such, the using the xLights and using Zoom and sharing screen and everything, I just cannot emphasize enough to everyone else that's new that this is the place to be, to just ask those questions and learn, and don't get overwhelmed, because it is so much easier than you think it is. It's there's so much overthinking that goes into this hobby. And it's so simple when you boil it down, that you are just running a little bit of electricity through a bulb and making it turn colors. But this has been definitely rewarding. Wife and family, and some of the visitors that come by, I think they visited more than once because somehow they knew my name, and some of the teenagers would be out there dancing, calling my name and such. And so, yep, it was definitely a great experience. And I'm hoping to get bigger this year.
Very cool. Thanks. Anybody else have any feedback?
I'm just going to say that, the length of your show depends greatly upon where you live at, compared to city or country. I live out in the country. I have two neighbors that I have to deal with, which, like I said, I talk to them all during the year, before before I start set up, I go talk to them, tell them, it's that time of year again, and just to stay on, on contact with them and let them know what's going on. And my show, like I said, I'm a little bit unusual. I have plenty of parking space. So my show's a little bit longer. I normally during the week I run 45 minutes or so on a loop. I can handle 50 to 75 cars sitting out front, no problem. So this past year I run actually 4 different shows. I run a different one every night for 4 nights, and then repeated. And when I actually got closer to Christmas, matter of fact, Christmas Eve and Christmas night, I extended my show and played every song I had, which made it almost an hour and a half long. So, traffic, it was hectic, but it's because I have the parking area. It wasn't that bad. Folks come, sit, watch a show, and once they've seen it through, majority of them move right on, move along, make room for others. But it just, that just depends upon, where are you at and what have you got for parking room for, what street is it hectic? Like my street, I'm on a side street, a little cut through. It's not a main road, so I don't have to worry about that. I do not market my show. I have a Facebook page, but that's about it. I go in and I tell them when the lights come on, and that's about all I do. I don't get out there and advertise it. It's just by word of mouth. I actually have turned down opportunities for newspaper and TV and stuff like that because I don't want to add any more than what I've already got, traffic wise. It's not uncommon for me, especially on the weekends, to see 300 to 500 cars, which from where I'm at in the country is quite a few, because the nearest town to me is 7 miles, which is not, it's not that far, but still, for folks driving this to come out and see a few Christmas lights blink, I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think that there's no one size fits all model. I think that you really do have to understand your display in your neighborhood and your area, and do what's right, and be involved with your display, and know that if there's a problem, you can start tweaking things, and just to realize, hey, my show's too short, my show's too long, I need to vary this and that, and not be scared to make adjustments. Just because you throw in a bunch of songs at the start of the season doesn't mean that's what you have to do the whole season. You can make adjustments.
Okay, next topic.
So finally, teardown and storage. So when do you tear down your show? I know some people tear down, shut their show off right after Christmas. Some wait till New Year's. Some wait till, the Epiphany and things like that. So when do you tear it down? How do you store it? What's some tricks there? Do you take all, like others were talking about earlier, do you take your props all apart? Do you try to store them intact? When do you go and repair any kind of defects you may have? We had a lot of feedback as I was preparing for this as far as how do you label things. I think that's an important thing and an important lesson to learn, is to really label and map out things on how they came down so you can put them back up in the right order. And that's something that I do in a lesson that I learned. So any kind of tips and tricks and, things that got damaged. So one thing that I did this year is I went to the Boscoyo, roll strip, and it's great. It's really, it's great stuff. But I stored it kind of twisted up and torqued up and all that. And when I took it out, man, those strings were twisted all to heck. Now, once they sat out in the sun for a few days, they straightened up. But this year when I stored them, I kind of stored them in a way that was more thoughtful, and that was, where they're laying flat so they won't be all twisted and kinked. And that, once again, that's not to say that that they won't straighten out in the sun, because they did. But I have the luxury of being able to store them flat, so I am. And so that was a lesson that I took away. So anyway, what are some of your teardown tips, tricks, lessons learned?
most important thing of all, before you touch anything, is go out in your yard with your camera and take pictures of everything. Take it from the street, take close-ups, take a look at how you ran the wires, so you will forget how you did it following and then you'll kind of go, oh, I got to reinvent this. So take a lot of pictures.
I agree with that completely.
I agree. Not only pictures, but video. And then the other thing I like is when people post their behind the scenes video and you get to see how they set their show up. I also learn quite a lot by that. So
that's great feedback. All right, what else?
I will say take down every wire one wire at a time. Literally take them down one wire at a time, roll them up. If you've already labeled them, great. If you haven't labeled them, label them. But one wire at a time, zip tie them in a coil, and put them aside. Do not, in any way, shape, or form, take down your display and throw a big pile of wires. I did that my first year, 4 years ago. Oh, good God, what a nightmare.
Amen, John. Amen.
One wire at a time.
Yeah, and I organize all my extension cables in totes by length. So I've got 5 foot, 10 foot, and 25 foot extension cables. And just like John's saying, I take them all down and I coil them up and put them there. My father-in-law actually gave me a good tip as I was tearing down this year. He was helping me. And he said, you really ought to take a little different color pieces of phasing tape, because as we're setting up and you've got stuff laying out, he said you ought to put like red tape around the 5 foot, some green tape around the 10 foot, some blue tape around the 25 foot, just a little stripe. So as you're looking around your feet, you can really tell what you have. And I thought that was a pretty good lesson to learn. So I'm going to implement that this year, is just, put a little bit of color around my extension cables, although I store them separately. Inevitably, when you're looking around, just to be able to look at it quickly and tell what you got.
I have a couple props that I store in tubs, and I make sure that the extension cords go in that tub with the prop.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Dave from Australia, where'd you go? I don't know if you dropped.
This year, I learned the better way for me to pack up was actually as I was tearing down, I was also getting ready for this year's display. So I actually moved props and controls around to where they'll be for this year as I was coming down. So then I've already made a start. So instead of putting everything away to pull it back out later, as I was moving things, I was tearing down and moving props and controls ready for this year. So it's already started my setup process for this year.
Great.
That's good. All right.
Plus, with the extensions, I roll them up into areas. So my roof extensions, or my window extensions, all those, because I make them as I go. They're all made for my props, and then they just get taped into bundles, and I just use they're all just marked up. So I've got my roof bundle. So when I go on my roof, I just literally take the bundle. I've got everything I need up there. Not going to guess what I need unless I add stuff to it.
That's good feedback.
When it comes to labeling, I bought a roll of cloth Johnson & Johnson bandage tape and cut off a piece of it, wrapped it around the tail end of the pigtail, and now I've got a cloth surface that I take a Sharpie and write the channel number dash control, just the number that I need on both sides. That way when I'm hooking up pigtails, I've got a bunch of them dangling, and I got, I need to hook up 2-1. I can reach over and grab 2-1 from the strand off the tree, which is also labeled, and marry those two outputs without any problems.
I label the pigtails. Yeah, label the pigtails, and I put the number of pixels on each string on there too. More information, the better.
Yeah, that's smart.
So from chat, there's a couple points. First one is I mark any problem pixels or strings with masking tape, so I know which ones I have to fix before they go back up. I cover the connectors with the tape so that I can't accidentally use it. This person says all my Boscoyo snowflakes are stored by hanging them. I don't like them sitting flat. I sort my wires in totes with the totes labeled to specific controllers. So tote will be labeled controller number 1, etc. Probably obvious here, but make sure everything is dry before you store it. Wet storage always leads to problems. One thing I learned was to be sure I store the controllers last, so I put them out first for testing and label everything. So sounds good.
Good stuff.
And no harm in spraying insect spray on everything before you put it away in storage either.
Ah, interesting.
So one last thing about labeling, and I didn't do this when I first started. I wish I would have. Is, you know, I know we talk about controller connections and channels, but as you build your display over the years, it's going to change dramatically. It's going to change over and over and over again. But the aspect of labeling it, I would say, is if you can take and put a label on it and then use the clear silicone-based heat shrink wrap and put it over it, you won't have to worry about it, you know, degrading over time. It's just going to be there and be sealed, and you can always read it year after year after year.
Good idea.
So 2 last points before we wrap up. Russell says in chat, I keep a laminated sheet inside the controller box that has which prop goes to port number or whatever. And then another person says, I write all my controllers and connections in a notebook. I call it my xLights Bible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do the same thing. I've got a photo of my house, and I go and number the props, like my verticals. They're all different lengths, and so I'll have, this is vertical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and those correspond to a picture of my house. Same thing. I tuck that away, and that way, when I grab vertical number 5, I know which run that it goes on, and I can correspond that. So I do think it's important to document that and to have that written down. Good stuff. All right.
Somebody mentioned when you tear down your show. I think, I live in a snowy climate, and usually it's the first clear, dry day after January 1st. So that will vary.
Okay. Well, Russell, is that it?
That's it. So I think we've answered all your questions. I really do appreciate it, guys. And I know Ed's got to get the Transworld people on. He's got to get the cane and drag me off the stage. So anyway, but after that, we can sit around and talk more, and on a more informal basis. But hopefully this was helpful. I enjoyed it. I've been taking notes the whole time, and it's always interesting just to be able to talk, not just from my perspective or someone else's perspective, but really learn from the community, because you hear a lot of different things, some that we all do the same and some that I've never considered before. And so I think it's valuable just to sit around and have this debrief. And I hope it was valuable for everybody.
So thank you, Russell.
The xLights project exists because of people like you. Help continue the project by making a donation today at xlights.org/donate.